December 7, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor burned, marked America's entry into a war already raging across two continents, but thousands of miles away in occupied Poland. One man had been waging his own silent war for over a year. Witold Pilecki stood in the shadows of Warsaw's crumbling streets, watching German soldiers march past with mechanical precision, and made a decision that would defy every human instinct for survival. He would volunteer to be captured and imprisoned in Auschwitz, the camp whispered about in terrified voices throughout the Polish underground, to gather intelligence from inside hell itself. The plan was madness incarnate. Captain Pilecki, a cavalry officer turned resistance fighter, had survived Poland's 1939 invasion and witnessed his country's dismemberment between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. While others fled or hid, he formed the secret Polish Army, one of the first resistance organizations in occupied Europe. But by September of 1940, rumors reached Warsaw of a new type of German camp near the town of Auschwitz in German, where prisoners disappeared into a void of silence. The Polish underground needed eyes inside those walls, and Pilecki knew that intelligence gathered from escaped prisoners was incomplete and outdated. Someone had to go in voluntarily, survive, build a resistance network inside, and somehow get information out. On September 19, 1940, Pilecki walked deliberately into a German street roundup in Warsaw's Żoliborz district, carrying false identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński. He joined 2,000 other terrified Poles being herded like cattle onto trucks, their destination unknown. Within days he arrived at Auschwitz, prisoner number 4335, and stepped into a universe where death was currency and survival a daily miracle. The camp in those early months bore little resemblance to the industrialized killing machine it would become. Originally constructed as a detention center for Polish political prisoners, Auschwitz in late 1940 was still finding its murderous rhythm. Prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and random violence, but the gas chambers of Birkenau remained months away. Pilecki watched, learned, and began identifying men he could trust. Soldiers, intellectuals, priests, anyone with the strength to resist despite the daily assault on human dignity. According to documentation later compiled by the Polish Underground Study Trust, Pilecki organized prisoners into cells of 5 men each, none knowing members of other cells, creating a resistance network called the Union of Military Organizations. They stole food, redistributed it to the weakest prisoners, documented SS crimes, and maintained morale through whispered news from outside. Most audaciously, they began smuggling reports out through released prisoners and civilian workers, detailed accounts of camp conditions that Pilecki wrote on scraps of paper hidden in laundry or baked into bread. The intelligence was staggering. Pilecki reported the first uses of Zyklon B gas in September 1941, when Soviet prisoners of war were murdered in experimental gassings. He documented the arrival of Jewish transports, the expansion of Birkenau, and the systematic extermination process as it evolved from bullets to gas chambers. His reports reached London through the Polish government in exile, providing some of the earliest eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust in progress. Yet Western allies struggled to believe the scale of atrocity he described. Genocide seemed too fantastical, too medieval for the 20th century. April 26, 1943 arrived with spring attempting to soften Auschwitz's brutality, but 2.5 years inside had taught Witold Pilecki that seasons changed nothing about death. He had survived typhus, pneumonia, countless beatings, and the psychological torture of watching thousands march to gas chambers while he documented their murders. His resistance network numbered nearly 1,000 prisoners, but Pilecki recognized a terrible truth. Without external military intervention, no internal resistance could stop the killing machine. The Polish underground needed more than reports. They needed a survivor who could testify in person, who could make the unbelievable real. Pilecki planned his escape with 2 trusted Confederates, Jan Redzai and Edward Ciesielski. The bakery where they worked sat near the camp perimeter, and after months of observation, they identified a vulnerability. On the night of April 26th, during a shift change in the guard rotation, the 3 men cut through a back door, slipped past watchtowers obscured by strategic positioning of buildings, and ran into the night. Dogs barked, sirens wailed, but darkness swallowed them. They reached the Soa River, crossed on a makeshift raft, and disappeared into the Polish countryside. The journey back to Warsaw took weeks of moving through forests, hiding in sympathetic homes, and avoiding German patrols that saturated occupied Poland. Pilecki carried his most detailed report yet, 48 pages of handwritten testimony covering every aspect of Auschwitz's operations. He reached Warsaw in May and immediately pressed his commanders for action. Storm the camp, he urged. The Allies could drop paratroopers, the Polish Home Army could attack from outside, and his internal resistance would rise from within. Together they could free tens of thousands and destroy the crematoriums. His superiors listened with horror and admiration, but delivered crushing news. No attack would come. The military resources required were impossible to assemble. The Allies, fighting in North Africa and preparing for Italy, would not divert assets for a prison camp liberation, no matter how detailed Pilecki's reports. Stalin's Soviet Union, racing toward Poland from the east, had its own agenda and no interest in saving Polish lives. Pilecki had escaped the impossible only to discover that the world would not act on what he had witnessed. The betrayal of inaction became Pilecki's second torture. He continued fighting with the Home Army, participating in the August 1944 Warsaw Uprising, where Polish fighters held off Germans for 63 days before surrender. Captured again, he was sent to a German POW camp, a vacation compared to Auschwitz, and liberated by American forces in May 1945. He had survived the war, but Poland's nightmare continued. When the Red Army occupied Poland, installing a communist puppet government, Pilecki made another impossible choice. While thousands of former Home Army soldiers fled to the west, he returned to Poland under an assumed name to gather intelligence on Soviet security apparatus. The communist regime, paranoid about resistance movements, hunted former Home Army members as enemies of the state. In 1947, the secret police arrested Pilecki, and this time, there would be no escape. The trial was a show performance. Prosecutors accused him of being a Western spy, of fabricating Auschwitz atrocities to damage socialism's reputation, of plotting to overthrow the people's government. The real crime was his loyalty to a free Poland that no longer existed. On May 25, 1948, guards led Witold Pilecki to a basement execution chamber in Warsaw's Mokotów prison. He was 47 years old. A single bullet to the back of the head ended the life of a man who had volunteered for Auschwitz, survived 947 days inside, escaped, fought in an uprising, and returned to his occupied homeland. His family never learned where authorities buried his body. For decades, Communist Poland erased Pilecki from history. His reports remained classified, his name unspoken, his heroism buried beneath ideological concrete. Only after communism's collapse in 1989 did historians begin recovering his story. In 2006, Poland posthumously awarded him the Order of the White Eagle, the nation's highest honor. November 30, 1939, brought temperatures plummeting far below freezing across the Karelian Isthmus, where Finnish soldiers crouched in snow-covered forests watching a Soviet armada approach. 3 days earlier, Stalin had ordered the Red Army to invade Finland after fabricating a border incident, expecting his 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft to crush the tiny Nordic nation within weeks. But as Soviet columns pushed across the frontier, they encountered an enemy that refused to fight by conventional rules, and among those defenders stood a quiet farmer named Simo Häyhä, who would become the deadliest sniper in military history. Häyhä was 33 years old when war erupted, a man of few words who had spent his life in Rautjärvi, a rural municipality near the Soviet border. He stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, his weathered face revealing little emotion, his hands calloused from farm work and hunting. Finland's military had trained him as all Finnish men, and he had earned marksman badges during his mandatory service. But nothing in his peaceful existence suggested the legend he would become. When mobilization orders arrived, Heha reported to his unit, the 6th Company of JR-34, part of the Finnish army defending the Kola River sector, and began killing Soviet soldiers with methodical efficiency that seemed supernatural. The war's opening weeks revealed the Red Army's catastrophic unpreparedness. Stalin's purges of the 1930s had executed thousands of experienced officers, leaving the military commanded by political loyalists who prioritized ideology over tactical competence. Soviet troops, many from warm southern republics, had no winter warfare training and attacked in massed formations across frozen terrain where Finnish defenders could annihilate them from concealment. The Finns employed Mahdi tactics, surrounding and isolating Soviet units in the forests, then systematically destroying them, turning their numerical weakness into an advantage. Heha operated as a traditional sniper, without telescopic sights that could glint in sunlight and reveal position. He used iron sights on his standard-issue Mosin Nagant M2830 rifle, modified to suit his short stature and shooting style. His positions were masterpieces of camouflage, snow-covered trenches where he lay motionless for hours in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius, a white sheet over his winter uniform, his face whitened with powder. He kept snow in his mouth to prevent his frozen breath from revealing his location. When targets appeared, Soviet officers, machine gunners, or infantry, Heha fired single, precise shots, then immediately shifted position before return fire arrived. Contemporary accounts from the Finnish military archives document Heha's extraordinary tally. Between November 30th, 1939 and March 13th, 1940, the war's 105 days, he recorded over 500 confirmed kills with his rifle, plus approximately 200 with a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun during close-quarters combat. The figures seemed impossible, averaging nearly 5 kills per day throughout the campaign, but multiple witnesses, unit commanders, and written records corroborated them. Soviet soldiers began calling him the White Death, a ghost in the snow who killed without warning. The Red Army attempted specialized measures to eliminate Heha. They sent counter-snipers who never returned. They directed artillery barrages at suspected positions, wasting shells on empty forest. They launched night raids that found only footprints in the snow. Heha's secret was mundane: extraordinary skill combined with intimate knowledge of local terrain, enhanced by Finland's endless winter darkness that provided natural concealment. He was defending his homeland, fighting on ground he had hunted since childhood, motivated by survival rather than glory. On March 6, 1940, a week before the war's end, Heha's luck fractured. An explosive bullet, whether from a Soviet counter-sniper or a lucky random shot remains disputed, struck his lower left jaw, destroying half his face. Comrades found him unconscious in a pool of frozen blood and dragged him to a field hospital. Medics expected him to die, but Heha regained consciousness on March 13th, the day Finland and the Soviet Union signed an armistice. March 13, 1940 arrived with bittersweet silence across Finland's frozen battlefields, where 3 months of savage combat had transformed Soviet expectations of quick victory into a humiliating lesson in winter warfare. Simo Heha lay in a hospital bed in Hamina, his face wrapped in bandages, unable to speak through his shattered jaw, while diplomats in Moscow signed papers surrendering 11% of Finnish territory to Soviet annexation. Finland had survived as an independent nation, but the cost weighed heavily on a population of 3,700,000 who had faced a superpower's wrath. The Winter War's statistics told a story of heroic resistance and brutal arithmetic. Finland suffered approximately 25,000 dead and 43,000 wounded, devastating losses for such a small nation. But Soviet casualties shocked military observers worldwide. Estimates ranged from 126,000 to 168,000 dead, with 300,000 wounded. Stalin's massive advantage in men and materiel had met Finnish tactical brilliance, devastating winter conditions, and the home field advantage of defenders who knew every frozen lake and forest trail. The Red Army's embarrassing performance convinced Adolf Hitler that the Soviet military was incompetent, a miscalculation that would lead Germany to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, with catastrophic consequences. Simo Heha's recovery defied medical expectations. The explosive bullet had destroyed his left cheek, shattered his jaw, and left his face permanently disfigured. Surgeons performed multiple reconstructive operations over the following years, gradually rebuilding what they could. He would never look the same, and chronic pain became his lifelong companion. But he survived when survival seemed impossible. The Finnish military promoted him from corporal to second lieutenant, a rare battlefield commission, and he became a national hero, though he never sought the attention. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland joined as a co-belligerent in the Continuation War, seeking to reclaim lost territories. Heha, still recovering from his wounds, did not return to combat. His fighting days had ended in that moment on March 6 when an explosive bullet had found him in the snow. Instead, he spent the war years recuperating, undergoing surgeries, and occasionally meeting with military officials who sought his expertise on sniper training and winter warfare tactics. The Continuation War ended in September 1944 with Finland once again forced to accept Soviet terms, including the same territorial losses, plus additional concessions and reparations. Finland escaped Soviet occupation and maintained its independence, but the peace came with strings attached, a delicate balancing act between Western democracy and Soviet demands that would define Finnish foreign policy throughout the Cold War. For men like Heha, the double sacrifice felt bitter. They had bled twice to defend their homeland, and while Finland remained free, it was a freedom shadowed by its massive eastern neighbor's looming presence. After the war, Heha returned to farming in Ruokolahti, living quietly in a small house near the Soviet border that his heroism had failed to move. He never married, never sought publicity, and rarely discussed his wartime experiences. When journalists and military historians eventually tracked him down in later decades, they found a modest, soft-spoken man who seemed uncomfortable with his legendary status. Asked how he had become such an effective killer, Heha offered a simple answer: practice. When pressed about his feelings regarding the men he had killed, he reportedly said, "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could." The Finnish government awarded Heha numerous decorations, including the Cross of Kolaja, Medal of Liberty, and honorary rifle presentations. In 1940, President Risto Ryti personally presented him with a custom-made Sako M2830 rifle, a replacement for the weapon damaged in the same attack that had destroyed his face. Heha kept it his entire life, but never used it for combat again. He died on April 1, 2002, at the age of 96, one of the last surviving heroes of the Winter War, taking with him firsthand memories of those frozen days when a nation of farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers had held back a superpower's mechanized army. His legacy endures in military sniper training programs worldwide, where his tactics and achievements remain studied and debated. May 10, 1940 brought hell to earth over the skies of Belgium and France, as German bombers and fighters unleashed Blitzkrieg, lightning war, that shattered Allied defenses and sent millions fleeing southward in panicked exodus. In England, Edith Cavell had been dead for 25 years, executed by German firing squad in October 1915 for helping Allied soldiers escape occupied Belgium during the First World War, but her spiritual descendants now prepared to follow her example. Among them was Nancy Grace Augusta Wake, a woman who would become the Gestapo's most wanted person in France, surviving through courage, improvisation, and a refusal to accept defeat that seemed almost pathological. Nancy Wake was 28 years old when France fell, a New Zealand-born journalist living in Marseille with her wealthy French husband, Henri Fioca. She had witnessed the rise of fascism firsthand while working as a reporter in Vienna during the 1930s, attending Nazi rallies where she saw brown shirts beat Jewish shopkeepers in the streets. The experience had left her with a visceral hatred of Nazism and a determination to fight it however possible. When Germany conquered France in June 1940, dividing the nation between direct occupation in the north and the collaborationist Vichy regime in the south, Wake made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She would join the French resistance. Initially, Wake's work involved simple courier duties, carrying messages between resistance cells, moving hidden documents, helping Allied airmen shot down over France reach neutral Spain. Her cover was perfect. a wealthy socialite who loved parties, fashion, and nightlife. Someone German officers and Vichy officials assumed was frivolous and harmless. Behind the champagne and charm, Wake was memorizing German patrol schedules, identifying collaborators, and establishing escape routes through the Pyrenees Mountains that would eventually save over 1,000 Allied personnel. By 1943, the Gestapo had identified a resistance operative they codenamed the White Mouse for her ability to slip through their nets. They knew she was organizing escape lines, smuggling refugees and downed pilots to Spain, but every raid found empty safe houses and cold trails. The Gestapo placed a 5 million franc bounty on her head, one of the highest rewards offered for any resistance member. What they did not know was that the White Mouse was Nancy Wake, the charming woman they had seen at social gatherings whose pleasant conversations had sometimes concealed her mental cataloging of their unit assignments and personal weaknesses. The net tightened in 1943 when Gestapo surveillance identified Wake as a suspect. She barely escaped arrest, fleeing to Spain through the escape routes she had helped establish, leaving behind her husband Henri, who refused to abandon his business and believed the authorities would not harm him. Wake made it to England, where the Special Operations Executive, SOE, Britain's sabotage and espionage organization, recruited her for training. She learned radio operation, weapons handling, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, and parachute jumping, preparing to return to occupied France as a fully trained agent. On April 29, 1944, 5 weeks before D-Day, Wake parachuted into the Auvergne region of central France as part of a 3-person SOE team codenamed Freelance. Their mission: link up with Maquis resistance groups, rural guerrilla fighters, and prepare them to support the Allied invasion by disrupting German communications, sabotaging infrastructure, and tying down enemy units far from the Normandy beaches. Wake discovered approximately 7,500 Maquis fighters scattered across the region, brave but poorly armed, organized, and trained. She set about transforming them into an effective military force. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Wake coordinated weapons drops, distributed arms and explosives, trained fighters in tactics, and led raids against German installations. She cycled over 200 kilometers through enemy-occupied territory to radio for help when her team's wireless operator was killed, making the journey there and back in under 72 hours. She personally killed a German sentry with her bare hands during a raid when shooting would have alerted the garrison. When Maquis fighters expressed reluctance to take orders from a woman, she outdrank, outcursed, and outfought them until they accepted her leadership. After liberation, Wake received devastating news. The Gestapo had arrested Henri Fiocca in 1943 after her escape, tortured him for information about her whereabouts and activities, and eventually executed him when he refused to betray her. The man she loved had died protecting her while she fought in the hills. The guilt never fully left her. September 3, 1945 marked 6 years exactly since Britain's declaration of war against Nazi Germany, and now the war was finally over. Victory secured through blood, sacrifice, and the combined efforts of millions who had refused to submit to tyranny. Nancy Wake stood among the survivors, decorated with medals from multiple nations: the George Medal from Britain, the Médaille de la Résistance and Croix de Guerre from France, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, recognizing her extraordinary service. Yet the recognition felt hollow when weighed against the cost. Her husband dead, her youth consumed by violence, and a world forever changed by 6 years of industrial-scale slaughter. Wake's post-war life became a long reckoning with survival. She worked briefly for British intelligence in the occupied zones of Germany, then struggled to find purpose in peacetime. The skills that had made her invaluable during the war: improvisation under pressure, comfort with violence, ability to function in chaos, translated poorly to civilian existence. She returned to Australia in 1949, tried various careers, and eventually remarried in 1960. But the ghosts never fully released their grip. Fellow SOE agents reported similar struggles: the intensity of wartime operations, the constant proximity to death. The necessity of violence had marked them in ways peacetime society could not understand or accommodate. Historical accounts, including detailed documentation in Sarah Helm's A Life in Secrets examining SOE's French section, reveal that Wake was among the minority who survived. Of the 39 female SOE agents sent into France, 13 died in concentration camps, murdered by the Nazis after capture and torture. The survival rate for male agents was similarly grim. These were not soldiers who could surrender and expect prisoner of war treatment under Geneva Conventions. They were spies who, if caught, faced interrogation by the Gestapo, deportation to camps like Ravensbrück and Buchenwald, and eventual execution. That Wake survived and succeeded was testament to extraordinary courage, but also to luck, and she knew it. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Wake gave occasional interviews, always deflecting attempts to portray her as a hero. "I was no heroine," she insisted repeatedly. "I was just doing what had to be done." When journalists pressed her about killing Germans, she showed no remorse. "I don't see why we women should wave our men a proud goodbye and then knit them balaclavas. I'd rather shoot him myself." The quote became famous, illustrating Wake's practical view of warfare. Nazis were trying to conquer the world and exterminate entire populations, so killing them was not a moral dilemma, but a necessity. France struggled with its resistance legacy in the decades following liberation. The Gaullist narrative emphasized French resistance to occupation, while minimizing the collaboration that had characterized Vichy and much of French society. The reality was more complex. Active resistance members numbered in the tens of thousands, while millions had accommodated or actively supported German occupation. By the war's end, sudden resistance credentials appeared among people whose wartime records suggested otherwise. Genuine resistors like Wake watched this historical revisionism with cynicism, knowing who had actually risked everything and who had simply waited to see which side would win. Wake returned to Britain in the 1980s, settling in London and later a retirement home, where she lived until August 7, 2011, dying at age 98. Her funeral attracted veterans, diplomats, and historians, all paying respects to one of the war's genuine heroines. France made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, and Australia eventually recognized her contributions with various honors, though she had often expressed bitterness about her homeland's initial indifference to her wartime service. Her story represents thousands of similar tales from the Second World War. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, making impossible choices, living with the consequences. The resistance movements across occupied Europe, French Maquis, Polish Home Army, Yugoslav partisans, Italian partisans, Norwegian resistance, comprised millions who refused to accept defeat. Most remain nameless in historical records, their sacrifices known only to family members and local communities. Wake achieved fame partly because she survived, partly because she was willing to tell her story, and partly because her achievements were so extraordinary, they demanded recognition. The question that haunted many resistance veterans was whether their sacrifices had mattered. The Allies won the war through conventional military force, armies, navies, air forces, not guerrilla actions. Yet intelligence provided by resistance networks, sabotage that disrupted German logistics, and the thousands of German soldiers tied down fighting guerrillas rather than facing Allied forces all contributed to victory's eventual arrival. Perhaps more importantly, the resistance proved that occupied populations had not accepted their fate, that collaboration was not inevitable, that some people would fight even when fighting seemed futile. August 13, 1940 arrived with clear skies over southern England, and German bomber formations filled those skies like mechanical locusts, beginning the sustained aerial assault that would become known as the Battle of Britain. Adolf Hitler had conquered continental Europe in less than a year, and now only the English Channel separated his Wehrmacht from complete victory in the West. The Royal Air Force stood as Britain's last defense, and among those pilots scrambling to intercept the German bombers was squadron leader James Nicholson, who would become the only fighter pilot of the Battle of Britain to receive the Victoria Cross, and who would survive an ordeal of fire that should have killed him 3 times over. Nicholson was 23 years old, a career RAF officer flying Hawker Hurricanes with 249 Squadron based at Boscombe Down. He had joined the RAF in 1936, completed training, and spent the war's first year in relative quiet, missing the Battle of France and the Dunkirk evacuation. By August 1940, he had accumulated substantial flying hours but little combat experience, a situation that was about to change catastrophically. The Battle of Britain had reached its peak intensity, with the Luftwaffe launching massive raids intended to destroy Fighter Command and clear the way for Operation Celian, the planned invasion of Britain. On August 16, 1940, Nicholson's squadron was scrambled to intercept a German bomber formation over Southampton. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, flying at 18,000 feet, Nicholson spotted several Junkers Ju-88 bombers and moved to attack. Before he could fire, cannon shells from a Messerschmitt Bf-110 that had stalked him from behind tore through his Hurricane. One shell struck the cockpit instrument panel, sending shrapnel into his left foot. Another ignited the gravity fuel tank directly in front of the cockpit, transforming his aircraft into a flying fireball. A third shell hit the canopy rail near his head, sending metal fragments into his left eye. The immediate instinct when your aircraft is on fire is to bail out. Delay means death. Nicholson reached for the canopy release, preparing to jump, when he spotted the Messerschmitt that had shot him down passing in front of his burning Hurricane. Through flames, pain, and the disorienting shock of being wounded, Nicholson made an extraordinary decision. He would stay in the burning aircraft and shoot down his attacker before bailing out. He pulled his Hurricane into position, flames engulfing the cockpit and burning through his flight suit, and opened fire with his 8 Browning machine guns. The Messerschmitt pilot, believing Nicholson's Hurricane was finished, had made a fatal error in crossing in front of a supposedly dying opponent. Nicholson's burst caught the German fighter, which began trailing smoke and descended in a steep dive toward the channel. Only then did Nicholson attempt to escape his burning aircraft, pulling the canopy release and trying to climb out. The canopy jammed. Flames were consuming the cockpit, melting his flight suit to his skin, burning his hands, face, and legs. With strength born of desperation, Nicholson forced the canopy open and threw himself from the aircraft at 12,000 feet. The nightmare continued during descent. Nicholson's parachute deployed, but he was so badly burned that he could barely move his hands or see clearly with his damaged eye. Then, incredibly, British Home Guard units on the ground mistook his descending parachute for a German airman and opened fire with rifles, hitting him multiple times in the buttocks and legs. He landed in a field near Millbrook, Southampton, critically wounded, severely burned, and shot by his own side, but alive. Civilians rushed to help, cutting away his charred flight suit and summoning an ambulance. Nicholson was conscious enough to ask if anyone had seen the German fighter go down. The question revealed his priorities. Even while suffering catastrophic injuries, he wanted confirmation of his kill. Medical personnel rushed him to Southampton Hospital, where doctors assessed injuries that should have been fatal: severe burns covering much of his body, shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, and smoke inhalation. They gave him morphine, began treating his burns, and prepared for a long, uncertain recovery. Nicholson spent months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries and painful burn treatments. The RAF conducted an investigation into the engagement, collecting statements from witnesses who had observed both the dogfight and Nicholson's descent. Ground observers confirmed the Messerschmitt had crashed into the channel, granting Nicholson the kill. More significantly, his squadron mates and superiors recognized that his decision to remain in a burning aircraft to shoot down an enemy fighter, despite having every justification to bail out immediately, represented courage of the highest order. On November 15, 1940, the London Gazette announced that squadron leader James Brindley Nicholson had been awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor. The citation read, "During an engagement with the enemy near Southampton on the 16th of August 1940, Flight Lieutenant Nicholson's aircraft was hit by 4 cannon shells. Wounded in 2 places and his aircraft on fire, he could have bailed out. Instead, he closed in on the enemy and fired, shooting it down." He was the only fighter pilot to receive the Victoria Cross during the entire Battle of Britain, a conflict that involved thousands of pilots and hundreds of dogfights. January 1941 brought James Nicholson back to limited flying duties. His burns healed enough for basic flight operations, but still requiring ongoing medical treatment, and leaving permanent scars across his body. The Victoria Cross had made him a national hero at a time when Britain desperately needed heroes, but Nicholson was uncomfortable with celebrity. He had done what any pilot should do in combat, he insisted, and the attention seemed disproportionate to the action. Nevertheless, the RAF utilized his fame for morale purposes, sending him on public appearances and speaking engagements designed to boost civilian spirits during the dark days of the Blitz. The Battle of Britain had ended in October 1940 with a clear RAF victory, the first major defeat for Hitler's military machine. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy Fighter Command meant Operation Celion was postponed indefinitely, and Britain survived as an island fortress from which eventual liberation of Europe could be launched. But the cost had been severe. 544 RAF aircrew killed, and many more wounded. The few, whom Winston Churchill immortalized in his famous speech, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," had saved their nation, but the war was far from over. Nicholson spent the next several years in various RAF postings, unable to return to frontline fighter operations due to his injuries. He transferred to staff positions, training duties, and eventually command of a flight training squadron. The work was important, but far from the combat flying he had trained for. Like many warriors, Nicholson struggled with being sidelined while his friends and comrades continued fighting. He requested transfers to operational units repeatedly, always facing rejection due to medical reasons. The burns had weakened his hands and limited his stamina in ways that made prolonged combat flying dangerous. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day and the final push into Germany, Nicholson was commanding No. 27 Squadron in India, part of the Burma campaign against Japanese forces. The Pacific Theater had become a brutal war of attrition through jungles and mountains, far from the aerial battles over England where Nicholson had earned his fame. On May 2, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender in Europe, Nicholson was flying as an observer in a B-24 Liberator bomber on a mission over the Bay of Bengal when the aircraft caught fire and crashed into the sea. The crew perished in the crash or drowned in the bay. His body was never recovered. The irony haunted those who knew his story. The pilot who had survived burning alive in his fighter during the Battle of Britain, who had overcome injuries that should have killed him, who had become the only fighter pilot Victoria Cross recipient of that crucial campaign, died in a plane crash while serving as a passenger thousands of miles from home. He was 29 years old, survived by his wife and 2 young children. The war in Europe would end 5 days later. The war against Japan would end in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nicholson died in the war's final weeks, one of the last casualties in a conflict that had consumed 60 to 85 million lives worldwide. Britain commemorated Nicholson with memorials, plaques, and the eternal honor accorded Victoria Cross recipients, but his death exemplified the war's arbitrary cruelty. Survival was random, death came without reason or warning, and heroism offered no protection against fate. His VC citation remains one of the most remarkable in British military history, describing an act of extraordinary courage performed while engulfed in flames, an act that would have been completely justified had he chosen differently. That he chose to fight rather than flee, to shoot down his enemy before saving himself, represented the spirit that allowed Britain to survive 1940 when survival seemed impossible. The Battle of Britain itself has become mythologized in British history, sometimes obscuring the reality of those who fought it. The pilots were not superhuman, they were young men, mostly in their early 20s, many still teenagers, who climbed into machines that could kill them through mechanical failure as easily as enemy action. They fought multiple missions daily during the battle's peak, exhaustion accumulating with each sortie, watching friends die in burning aircraft or failing to return from patrol. The psychological strain was immense, yet they continued fighting because the alternative was Britain's defeat and occupation. Nicholson's Victoria Cross represented all those pilots, the famous few and the many more who survived the Battle of Britain only to die in later campaigns, or who returned home carrying physical and psychological wounds that never fully healed. His decision to remain in that burning hurricane, to achieve one more victory before succumbing to his wounds, embodied the determination that preserved Britain's independence during its darkest hour. When the official history of the Victoria Cross was written, his citation stood among the most compelling. Wounded, burning, justified in saving himself, he chose instead to fight. That choice made him a symbol of a nation that refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed rational. June 6, 1944, D-Day, brought the Allied invasion of Normandy that would begin Western Europe's liberation from Nazi occupation, but the operation's success depended on advantages beyond military force. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel, protected by a secret weapon the Germans never suspected existed. The Allies could read their encrypted communications. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London, mathematical genius Alan Turing had helped crack the Nazi Enigma cipher machine, providing intelligence that Winston Churchill would later claim shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. But Turing's contribution remained classified for decades, and the man who saved millions of lives would be destroyed by his own country in peacetime. Turing had arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, just days after Britain declared war on Germany. He was 27 years old, a Cambridge mathematician whose theoretical work on computation had already established him as one of Britain's most brilliant minds. The government code and cipher school recruited him specifically to attack the Enigma problem. German military forces encrypted their communications using Enigma machines that seemed unbreakable through conventional cryptanalysis. The machines used rotating wheels and electrical pathways to scramble messages, with the settings changing daily according to codebooks. Even if Allied forces captured an Enigma machine without knowing the daily settings, the encrypted messages remained gibberish. Polish mathematicians had achieved the initial breakthrough in the 1930s, developing techniques to exploit Enigma's mechanical weaknesses. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Polish cryptologists escaped to France, bringing their knowledge to the Allies. They shared it with British intelligence, giving Bletchley Park a foundation to build upon. But the Germans had upgraded Enigma's complexity, adding rotors and altering procedures, making the Polish methods obsolete. Turing's task was to develop new approaches that could break the enhanced Enigma in time to produce actionable intelligence. Turing's solution was the bomb, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of possible Enigma settings per hour, searching for the correct configuration. The name derived from the Polish bomba, their earlier code-breaking machine, but Turing's version was far more sophisticated. The bomb exploited a critical German operational error. Many messages contained predictable text, called cribs by British cryptologists. Weather reports, for example, often included standard phrases like weather for the night at predictable positions. By knowing the plaintext and corresponding ciphertext, the bomb could systematically eliminate impossible settings until it found the correct one. The first bomb, installed at Bletchley Park in March 1940, was named Victory. Within months, additional bombs were constructed and deployed, eventually numbering over 200 machines operated predominantly by Women's Royal Naval Service members, Wrens, who worked in shifts keeping the devices running. The bombs were not computers in the modern sense. They performed a single specialized function, but they represented a crucial step in the development of automated computation. Turing's theoretical work on universal machines capable of performing any calculation would later become the foundation for electronic computers, but during the war, practical code-breaking took priority over theoretical exploration. Breaking Enigma did not mean reading every German message instantly. The process required capturing ciphertext, identifying cribs, running the bombs to find settings, then decrypting that day's backlog of messages. Intelligence officers had to analyze the decrypted messages, determine which were significant, and distribute relevant information to military commanders without revealing that Enigma had been broken. The decrypted intelligence was codenamed Ultra, and access was restricted to a tiny number of senior officers who understood that protecting the source was as important as using the intelligence. If Germany discovered the Allies could read Enigma, they would change their encryption methods, and the advantage would evaporate. Ultra-intelligence transformed the war's course in multiple theaters. In the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boat positions and orders became visible. allowing convoys to route around submarine wolf packs and directing hunter groups to attack German submarines when they surfaced to recharge batteries and radio reports. The North African campaign benefited enormously from knowledge of German supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean, enabling the Royal Navy and RAF to sink tankers and cargo ships before they reached Rommel's Africa Corps. The D-Day deception operation, which convinced Hitler that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, succeeded partly because ultra-intercepts showed German forces remaining in position where the fake invasion was expected. Turing's contributions extended beyond the bomb. He developed statistical techniques for analyzing code-breaking results, created methods for attacking German naval Enigma variants that used different procedures, and worked on breaking other German encryption systems. His colleagues at Bletchley Park described him as brilliant but unconventional. He chained his coffee mug to a radiator to prevent theft, bicycled to work wearing a gas mask during pollen season to combat hay fever, and sometimes gave lectures while lying on the floor. His homosexuality was known among close colleagues, but remained private in an era when such relationships were criminalized under British law. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender, and Turing received an Order of the British Empire for his contributions, a modest recognition for work that had been instrumental in Allied victory. But Ultra remained classified, and Turing could never publicly discuss his most important achievements. He transitioned to peacetime work, joining the National Physical Laboratory to design an electronic computer, then moving to the University of Manchester where he continued theoretical work on computation, artificial intelligence, and mathematical biology. His groundbreaking paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published in 1950, proposed what became known as the Turing test for machine intelligence, asking whether machines could think. January 1952 brought Detective Constable Robert Wills to Alan Turing's home in Wilmslow, Cheshire, investigating a burglary report that would destroy one of Britain's greatest scientific minds. Turing had reported a break-in, but during questioning, police discovered evidence of a homosexual relationship with Arnold Murray, a young man who had apparently helped orchestrate the burglary. In 1952, Britain, homosexual acts were illegal under the Labouchere Amendment of 1885, with convictions resulting in imprisonment. Turing, rather than deny the relationship, admitted it freely, his mathematical mind apparently unable to comprehend why private consensual behavior should concern the state. The trial in March 1952 was brief and humiliating. Turing pleaded guilty to charges of gross indecency, a catch-all offense used to prosecute homosexuality. The judge offered two sentencing options: imprisonment or chemical castration through hormone treatments. Turing chose the latter, undergoing a year of injections with synthetic estrogen designed to reduce libido. The treatment had devastating side effects: impotence, breast development, and severe psychological distress. His security clearance was revoked, ending his work with GCHQ, the successor to Bletchley Park's code-breaking operations. The man who had helped save Western civilization from Nazi conquest was now treated as a security risk and criminal by the nation he had served. Contemporary accounts from colleagues and friends described Turing's increasing depression and isolation following the conviction. The hormone treatments ended in April 1953, but the damage, both physical and psychological, persisted. He continued mathematical research, working on morphogenesis and pattern formation in biological systems, but the spark that had driven his wartime brilliance seemed diminished. He took holidays abroad, including a trip to Greece and Norway, seeking escape from Britain's stifling moral climate. Friends reported that he seemed to be recovering his equilibrium, but depression is a deceiving condition, often hiding its deepest despairs behind functional appearances. On June 8, 1954, Turing's housekeeper found him dead in his bed. An autopsy determined he had died from cyanide poisoning, with a partially eaten apple beside the bed. The coroner ruled death by suicide, concluding that Turing had laced the apple with cyanide and eaten it. He was 41 years old. His mother insisted throughout her life that his death was accidental. Turing had a small home laboratory where he conducted chemistry experiments, and she believed he had carelessly contaminated the apple. Some historians have supported this theory, noting that the apple was never tested for cyanide and that Turing had shown no obvious signs of suicidal intent in his final days. Others argue the suicide ruling was correct, pointing to his history of depression and the horrific treatment he had endured. The truth of Turing's death remains debated, but the injustice is undeniable. A man who had contributed incalculably to Allied victory, whose theoretical work laid foundations for the computer age, who possessed one of the 20th century's most extraordinary minds, was prosecuted, humiliated, and chemically tortured by the government he had served. The irony is savage. During the war, Turing's homosexuality was overlooked because his skills were indispensable. In peace, those same authorities destroyed him for the same characteristic they had previously ignored. Britain had needed his genius to survive, but once survival was assured, it could afford to enforce moral codes that valued conformity over contribution. For decades after his death, Turing's achievements remained classified. The Official Secrets Act prevented Bletchley Park veterans from discussing their wartime work, and Turing's role in breaking Enigma went unrecognized publicly. As late as the 1970s, most people who knew Turing's name associated him only with theoretical computer science, unaware of his war contributions. Only after declassification in the 1970s did historians begin reconstructing the full story of Ultra and Bletchley Park. F. H. Hinsley and Alan Stripp's Codebreakers, The Inside Story of Bletchley Park, published in 1993, provided detailed accounts from participants, finally revealing the scope of work that Turing and his colleagues had accomplished. Britain's treatment of Turing became a source of national shame as attitudes toward homosexuality evolved in subsequent decades. The 1967 Sexual Offences Act partially decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults in private, though full equality took decades more to achieve. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a public apology for Turing's treatment, calling it appalling and acknowledging that we were wrong. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. In 2017, the Alan Turing Law pardoned all men convicted under historical anti-homosexuality legislation. These gestures, however sincere, could not restore what was taken. Turing's potential contributions in the post-war decades, the computer science advances he might have pioneered, the mathematical discoveries he might have made, the students he might have mentored, were lost when Britain destroyed him. His story became a reminder that nations often treat their greatest servants shamefully, that moral panics and prejudice can destroy genius, and that posthumous recognition cannot compensate for injustice inflicted during life. The 8 stories presented here, Witold Pilecki's voluntary imprisonment in Auschwitz, Simo Häyhä's defense of Finland in winter snow, Nancy Wake's resistance work in occupied France, James Nicholson's decision to fight while burning, and Alan Turing's code-breaking genius, represent thousands of similar tales from World War II. Each demonstrates ordinary people rising to extraordinary circumstances, making impossible choices, surviving when survival seemed impossible, or dying in service to causes larger than themselves. Their legacies persist not just in the freedom their sacrifices secured, but in the reminder that courage, intelligence, and moral conviction can change history's course. The Second World War was humanity's most destructive conflict, consuming 60 to 85 million lives and reshaping the global order. It was won not through single heroic actions, but through the accumulated efforts of millions: soldiers who stormed beaches, factory workers who built weapons, scientists who developed technologies, resistance fighters who sabotaged occupiers, and civilians who endured bombing, starvation, and occupation without surrendering hope. The heroes celebrated here represent countless others whose names history never recorded, but whose contributions were equally vital. They defied the odds not because they were superhuman, but because circumstances demanded it, and they chose not to look away. That choice to fight rather than submit, to act rather than hide, to sacrifice rather than survive at any cost, defined a generation and preserved the possibility of a better world.